Hey everyone, welcome. It's Baron, and this is part 3 of my main path to the guide for the Arc Ignite Elementalist build. And in this part, we are going to go through the skill gem progression and the gear progression. Now, I'm not going to spend too terribly much time on the skill gem progression because a lot of this, especially the campaign stuff, we're going to be doing in the thorough beginner campaign walkthrough guide. So let's just go through quickly each section. Through Act 1, Holy Flame Totem is going to be our backup setup. We're going to try to set it up with Volley and Summon Phantasm if we can. I've got a few backup options there for you. Frost Bomb is a typical debuff because our main skill, before we get to the Cavern of Anger, is going to be Freezing Pulse, ideally linked with Volley and added cold damage. Again, I'm going to have these backups listed here without the check marks. These are what you'd get if you couldn't get the green set up there. The reason Frostbomb had this backup option of Orb of Storms is because once we are done with Freezing Pulse, once we get to the Cavern of Anger around level 12, 13, 14, 15, we're going to switch over immediately to our main skill gem of Arc. And it just so happens that Orb of Storms is the correct single target damage buff option when you're running Arc. So again, you can see here we've got a couple of backup damage options if you don't have the originals or if you have a different color socket setup. But let's go ahead and move forward. When we move forward, and again, this is going to be covered in much more detail in the walkthrough, we're going to be adding a Molten Shell cast when damage taken, Purifying Flame setup. Our auras, before we switch over to the more serious Malevolence Determination setup, our auras are going to be Summon Skitterbots, Herald of Thunder. This is going to be on the way up to that first labyrinth in Act 3, Act 4. And this is going to be before we've taken too much mana reservation efficiency on the tree. We can use Clarity. In fact, you could use it in Act 1 if you need it to maintain your mana. We're going to be using Wave of Conviction with Combustion to apply exposure. This is going to be particularly important once we do switch over to Ignite at the first labyrinth. You don't really need to use this before you start trying to deal Ignites with Shaper of Flames at that first labyrinth. Vitality, again, it's like Clarity. This is a totally optional setup here. It's quality of life. You can choose to take it if you've got the mana reservation efficiency for it and if you feel that you need it for your build. We can start introducing these things here. Frost Blink or Flame Dash, whichever you prefer for your Blink skill, is going to be mandatory. You definitely need a Blink skill, but Smite, Sigil of Power, optional DPS boost. Smite in particular, you've got to be cautious with. You cannot use Smite without a Scepter. A Scepter is the type of weapon that can both work as a melee weapon, so you can hit with a melee attack, like Smite. Smite gives you an aura which adds a bunch of lightning damage to your spells and attacks for a couple seconds, but Scepters also have the benefit of being able to roll spell modifiers. Spell damage, damage over time multiplier, +2 spell skill gem levels, that kind of a thing. There's no other weapon type in the game other than Scepter that can roll that type of modifier, but also do melee attacks. So you would need that before you switch over to Smite, but again, it is optional. Here's the crucial piece here. What you need to understand is that before we go to the labyrinth, we are doing standard lightning-based damage with Arc. Take whatever supports you can that Path of Building tells you are best in slot for you at that point. I've got Arcane Surge, Inspiration, potentially Controlled Destruction. If you happen to find a 4 link, you'll be starting to find 4 links around this time. But you can always look at Path of Building to see if anything else, added lightning damage, whatever, happens to work better for you at that time. Once we do take the labyrinth, we're going to swap over to the Ignite version and damage over time version. Swift Affliction, Burning Damage, Cruelty. We've got backup options here, so pardon me. It turned out that the best DPS setup that I found was Burning Damage, Cruelty, and added lightning damage, but there's so many options here depending on what the colors of your socket setup are. And then these are debuffs that you're only going to want to add after the labyrinth. Flame Surge is a spell that it does not inflict ignites on its own, but if you cast it on an enemy that is already ignited, it will cause burning ground under that enemy that improves the ignite by 25%. Basically, that's simplifying it. And then Flammability is a curse that lowers the enemy's fire resistance. Arcanist Brand is simply a spell that you can cast that will automatically cast any linked spells with it. Just make sure that you cast Arcanist Brand in the middle of a pack or on top of a boss enemy, because it can only cast the attached spells in a small radius without it, around it. So that'll bring us to the end of Act 3, beginning of Act 4, and our first Labyrinth. Moving on to the setup that we're going to try to build between Act 4 and Act 8. There's a couple of changes, so we are going to swap out our aura setup for the big one, Determination, Malevolence, both of which are 50% mono-reservation auras. You do need that mono-reservation efficiency on your tree before you can get to these. So I've got the tree set up in such a way that you take these around the time that you're about to switch over to these two auras. Determination to give you armor, Malevolence to give you damage over time multiplier. The other change that I've got here is with Arc, you start using Ignite Proliferation. You could use this earlier. Honestly, it just comes down to when the gem becomes available. So when Ignite Proliferation becomes available, start using it. It's going to help your clear speed. But other than that, I think the only major addition is that on the tree, I will have on the skill tree, I will have had you take Whispers of Doom to apply a second curse. So in addition to Flammability, you're also going to take Elemental Weakness. Arcanist Brand can apply all three of these curses. But other than that, those are the major changes for the second Labyrinth. Moving on to early maps, not too many changes here. Shield Charge, honestly, this is a setup that you can include as early as you want. It depends on when you want to switch over from a dual wand or dual scepter setup over to a shield setup. Honestly, I endorse moving to this as soon as possible. I might change the path of building to reflect this. Shield Charge with faster attacks is a great mobility skill. As soon as you get access to faster attacks and start leveling up that Shield Charge gem, it definitely starts feeling better than just moving around the old-fashioned way. So at this point in the early map setup, although I've included some alternate options for what your 6-link setup could look like, I've included Immolate and Unbound Ailments, I don't necessarily expect that you will have it at this point. You might, maybe you're lucky, maybe you're very studious, industrious, and you've got your 6-link already, but those are just there kind of as alternatives. So let's go ahead and move forward to your kind of mid-budget endgame. We're starting to make a few changes here, so I'm going to start to slow down a little bit. We're retaining this setup, Purifying Flame, Molten Shell, cast when damage taken. You're doing this mostly for the Consecrated Ground that it applies. At this point, we do assume that you've got the 6-link setup, and instead of the 6-link setup that I showed in the previous early mapping version, what I've got here assumes that you've made the basic, early currency, low currency upgrades to the build, and that you've taken the Call of the Brotherhood rings, which convert your lightning damage to cold damage, and that is what enables you to use the cold to fire support. Also, what I've got here is Inspiration. This is a support gem that you can use at literally any time. I've included it here because I think this might be, depends on how your mono reservation efficiency goes. This might be when your mono starts getting tight, but you can include Inspiration support at any time during this setup. Really, the big difference here is the cold to fire support. I'm putting this in the mid-budget setup because this is when I expect you will have swapped over to the Call of the Brotherhood rings. We are swapping lightning to cold and now cold to fire. The big thing about this is that it ensures that the highest amount of damage that's contributing to our ignites is fire damage, so we get that extra bonus from Shaper of Flames. Let's see here now. Here is an interesting change. So let's talk a bit about Vol Arc. I've mentioned this in earlier videos, but this is the point at which you would want to consider having Vol Arc. It is cheap to either make yourself or to get on trade. Vol Arc refers to a specific corrupted version of the gem. When you use a Vol Orb, on a skill gem. It has a variety of potential outcomes that will happen at random. For some gems, not all, but some, the potential outcome is to turn it into a vol version of the gem, which provides not one but two skills to add to your skill bar. You retain the normal arc skill, you can put that on your skill bar, but you also get the second skill as well, vol arc, which you can only cast after you have built up a certain number of souls, and you gain these souls by either hitting a strong enemy or killing a bunch of weak enemies. And it's important to cast this vol arc every once in a while because it is stronger, so it's going to deal more damage, it's going to spread to more enemies, but also it gives you this lingering buff that increases the damage of your main arc skill. So the ways that you can get this, look, if you're on Trade League and you don't mind just taking a few minutes and going and paying for it, this should come pretty cheap. The other way you can do it, if you want to do it yourself, is you can level a bunch of arc gems, just the same gem in a bunch of sockets in your weapon swap setup, and then at some point just corrupt them, hoping for the 1 in 4 outcome that you get a vol arc. Eventually you're going to want the very expensive option of getting a 2120 vol arc. That's going to take more effort than you can do right now in early maps, but for the moment we would make do with a level 20 vol arc, and if possible a level 20 with 20 quality vol arc. Why is that? Well, the quality is changing the number, it's increasing the number of times that the skill can chain, and that is a good thing. Both because it spreads to more enemies, but don't let that fool you. It's also important because the phrasing of the arc gem says that it deals more damage the more remaining arcs that it has. So that's important because if we have added arcs, the number of chains, to the end of the skill gem, then we have actually added to the damage of that first hit. So in fact, causing it to chain more times causes the first hit from arc to deal more damage. So that's important. The other change that we're making at this point is you can choose to include Tempest Shield. This is the version of the skill tree where I've got you taking some block related nodes. I've got you starting to beef up your mana reservation efficiency even more. If you can afford it, take it. And next up comes the big Chaos Inoculation changeover. So let's go ahead and do that. There's going to be even more to talk about here in the gear portion of this changeover, but in terms of skill gems, the really big mandatory one is taking Discipline. So this is kind of a no-brainer. Yes, you reserve some mana, but you get a big chunk of added flat energy shield, and all the sources of increased energy shield that we take on the tree and everywhere else are going to improve that. Certainly the energy shield recharge rate is great, but we're mostly taking this because it's just a big health boost. Now the optional take at this point is Purity of Ice. This you would take if you had managed to arrange your mana reservation efficiency and if you had begun to lean into the maximum cold resistance thing. So in the previous video where we talked about cluster jewels, we talked about making the decision to switch over to the Melting of the Flesh, Aegis Aurora, Purity of Ice, maximum cold resistance thing. You don't need to worry about Purity of Ice until you really commit to that. But this is what you would need if you wanted to start using that Nebulous Scepter. You're going to need Purity of Ice to boost up your maximum cold resistance, and that's what you're going to need to use that Nebulous Scepter. So you can either make this change all at once. You can make the swap to Chaos Inoculation and attempt to max out your cold resist, use Purity of Ice, get all that mana res efficiency, get your Nebulous Scepter all at the same time, or you can hold off on that and you can keep Purity of Ice out of the build for the moment, continue to use a rare scepter weapon, and just add Discipline at this point. And now we talk about the expensive endgame setup, and in terms of skill gems, this is about getting extra. You know, we're not changing too much factually about the build, we're just making them all better. So Vol Arc at a level 20 with quality of 20, this goes to level 2120. And this is the one area where being a niche off meta build kind of hurts us, because if you're a meta build, there are people constantly corrupting 2020 versions of your gem trying to sell the 2120 version of your gem. If you are an off-meta build, which this was when I was playing it, you don't get that benefit. So in fact, I ended up having to take a bunch of Arc gems to the temple, the Incursion temple myself, and attempt to corrupt them, and spent just way too much money trying to get a 2120 Vol Arc. I got pretty ridiculously unlucky, but hopefully your luck will be better than that. In any case, this is the expensive endgame version. That's why we're dealing with that. And, you know, if this build is a little more popular, maybe people other than yourself will be taking this gem to the temple and trying to corrupt it to sell to you, and that might drive the price down. Other than that, we are swapping to awakened versions of Swift Affliction, Burning Damage, Deadly Ailments. These are just strict upgrades from their normal versions. There's really not much to talk about there. If you really wanted to eke out a little bit of damage, you could go to level 21 versions of the curses. Level 21 version actually of Discipline I do recommend. That's just going to give you more flat energy shield. Level 21 versions of any aura is a good idea if you can afford it. It's not necessary, it's not your top priority currency wise, but it's a thing that you can do. Purity of Ice is probably the top priority because you want to get as much added maximum cold resistance as you possibly can. And the other change that I've got here is Vol Smite. This isn't a strict upgrade, not in my opinion. So this is kind of a lateral. Vol Smite, it operates under the same principle as Vol Arc. It is an added version of the gem, a corrupted version that does more. Under most circumstances, this would be a no-brainer. It's giving us more added lightning damage than the typical Smite gem would do. Here's the one problem that we've got to deal with. Vol souls they compete with each other, and so if you have Vol Smite on your skill bar and Vol Arc on your skill bar and you're killing enemies, they are splitting, so you actually get to use each of them less often if you have one another on the skill bar. So you kind of have to make a choice. Do I want to be able to use Vol Arc all the time, whenever I want, like it's constantly coming back up, or do I want to be able to mix in a Vol Smite every once in a while? I don't know the answer to this. I've done it both ways. Both are okay. If you want the smoother version, just use regular Smite and use it every once in a while when you need a single target boost. You don't need to use it all the time. You don't need to use it against trash mobs, just against bosses every once in a while. If you want to feel like you're doing the most damage possible at a slight inconvenience, you can juggle Vol Smite and Vol Arc, knowing that they are competing for resources with one another. So that's about it for the expensive endgame gem setup. And now we talk about the gear setup, and if there was not much to talk about for the skill gems during the campaign leveling, there's even less to talk about for the gear. And why is that? Well, you're not going to have this gear during leveling. You're just not. The whole point is, unless you are leveling this as your second or further build of the league, you're just going to be doing whatever you can to pick things up off the ground, getting what you can. So the whole purpose of this gear section for the early levels is just to tell you like the kinds of things you want to be on the lookout for. So yeah, early on you just want a wand or a scepter with, I mean, this would be great. This is more than you should expect to get. This is like the ideal state. +1 to skill gems, fire damage over time multiplier. You can also do increased fire damage, increased lightning damage. You can do regular damage over time multiplier. What you're going to want to be on the lookout for is to not do just regular flat added damage. If the modifier says flat added damage to spells, great. If it just says added X to Y damage, that only means attacks with that weapon, so avoid that. But other than that, this is my constant mantra. Life and resist, life and resist, life and resist. This is all just random gear that I've thrown together to give you the idea that you need life and resist. On your flasks, this is incorrect early on. For Act 1, you just need life and mana flasks. Don't worry about these flasks early on. But moving forward, there's really no differences, just even further emphasis on life and resist. I don't even think I changed these in the PoE setup, just everything that you can possibly do, picking up off the ground, identifying, using your crafting bench to get life and resist throughout the campaign. And yes, I guess the one thing to mention is you'll probably want to swap over to a scepter if you ever want to incorporate smite, as we just talked about. So at whatever time you want to incorporate smite into your build that you feel like you're not dealing enough damage, you want to add that in, you will need a scepter in order to do that. But there's really not much here to talk about. Now, getting into early maps, here's the thing that I want to draw your attention to. Yes, I have swapped us over to the Eye of Malice unique mask at this point. This is a very, very cheap unique. No matter how many people are playing this build and ones like it on League Start, this unique drops super commonly. So you're never going to have trouble getting this. Here's the thing. You don't necessarily want to switch over to this right away. The main reason we take this mask is because of the final modifier there that says nearby enemies have 50% increased fire and cold resistances. That seems like a major downside, but it's not. So with this build, we are taking a variety of methods of getting our enemies' resistances into the negative. And that increased, that is a mathematical term. Increased in this game simply means take whatever value it is and multiply it by 1.5. So if we are knocking our enemies' resistances into the negative, we are multiplying a negative number by 1.5, and we're getting an even more negative number. Here's the crucial thing, though. We actually need to be making the resistances negative for this to work. So I don't really want you to take this mask if you have not yet swapped over to gloves that have the Eldritch implicit for inflicting fire exposure on hit. Or if you level with an alternate skill gem setup than the one I'm recommending. So I just have you leveling with Arc to minimize the number of decisions you have to make. But if you go with a leveling setup that is Wave of Conviction, very respectable, very reasonable, that skill applies exposure on hit by itself. You could take Eye of Malice right away, the moment you can afford it, if you are leveling with Wave of Conviction. If you are leveling with Arc, you are not applying exposure on hit natively. You want to wait to take Eye of Malice until you are doing that, because exposure is one of the main methods of initially getting the enemy's resistances into the negative. And if we're not getting the enemy's resistances into the negative, this is actually a damage nerf for us. So you'd be better off just taking any old random helmet. So be careful of that. The take-home message here is do not use Eye of Malice unless you have a guaranteed method on every hit of causing fire exposure for the enemies. And the main way that's going to happen is if and when you are able to upgrade to gloves that have the Eldritch implicit apply fire exposure on hit. This version, this early maps version, does not include that because you're probably not going to be able to do it that early. It's just my experience that you're probably going to be into mid to late tier maps before that becomes available to you. Eldritch currency does not start dropping until late maps. So if you want to get it as early as possible, I would say buy a pair of gloves on trade if you can afford it that already has the implicit, and then craft the gloves with essences or something like that, because buying a bunch of the currency early on, the Eldritch Embers I think it is, early on is not going to be cost effective. Those are going to cost too much early on. So in any case, that's really the main thing to mention for early maps. Everything else is still just life and resist, and of course getting your attributes. At this point, you may need to get some dexterity and strength to afford your skill gems, and if you can afford it, if you can find it, plus to level of gems is great. You can get plus to level of gems on intelligence shields as well, but really life and resist is what I want you to focus on here during this early map setup. I have started including some flasks here that you can start thinking about. You don't need these are not mandatory yet, but they're going to be good. So if you can get these flasks, granite, quicksilver, silver, and basalt are the ones that I'm recommending. So granite adds flat armor, basalt adds percentage more armor. Those work well together. Quicksilver is your movement speed flask. Silver is for onslaught. I've got some good suffixes on these. Spell damage as energy shield leech is good. movement speed is good. These are like, if you can get them. These are completely optional, but your flasks are going to become more and more important as you begin affording the currency to enchant them with that use when flask charges reach full bench enchantment. But until then, these are kind of optional, and they can be lower priority, but don't ignore them entirely. Be prepared to spam your flasks in combat scenarios. They can help you stay alive. Now here's where things start getting a little spicy, a little interesting. This is where we're going to need to start taking at our mid-budget, but before we go to Chaos Inoculation setup, this is where I'm going to be telling you to take 2 Call of the Brotherhood rings. This is how we're going to be converting the lightning damage from arc into cold damage. And then from there, of course, we're using the support gem Cold the Fire support to convert some of that into fire damage and all the things we've already talked about. Here's the important thing about Call of the Brotherhood. The rarity, the drop rate of this item was changed at some point in the last several leagues. It used to be rarer than it is right now. I hope that it doesn't change back and go the other direction, but I suppose it could. At the moment, these are fairly easy to come by. If you are within a week of league start, you're probably going to be paying double-digit Chaos Orbs for this ring, but not triple digit. That's approximately what I can tell you. Somewhere between 10 and 60 Chaos Orbs for this ring, and it varies by the economy. But here's the part that's going to get potentially more expensive. Using catalysts on it. Catalysts are the only way to improve the quality on a piece of jewelry. Normally you only improve quality on things like armor and weapons. If you want to improve quality on jewelry, you use catalysts. They used to be the Metamorph currency item. When Metamorph was removed from the game, they became associated with Ultimatum instead. There are different types of catalyst, and the one that you want to use on this one are the Turbulent catalysts that increase the effect of elemental modifiers on the item. And the reason for that is because this item starts out with 40% lightning damage converted to cold, and we want to up that to 48% if we can. Now, these could be expensive on League Start. They're going to be at least a chaos each, I suspect, on League Start, these catalysts. So I could be, by telling you to get a total of 40 of these catalysts, I could be telling you to add as much as 40, 50, 60, 70 chaos to your early budget. And again, this is not intended to be a major upgrade. This is like your middle of maps, just starting red maps kind of upgrades here. So that is potentially asking a lot of you. You can do this without using the catalyst. You can only convert 80% by using 40 on one ring, 40 on the other. Without the catalyst upgrade, you can use these without the catalyst. It just means that you are getting less damage out of your cold to fire support gem, and you might want to check in Path of Building if there is a better support gem that you can use until you are converting almost all, 96% of lightning damage to cold damage. Because remember, that cold to fire gem is only giving you additional damage based on how much cold damage you are doing. So if you're not getting as much lightning damage converted over to cold damage, that cold to fire gem is not doing as much for you. Other than this one setup though, there's not too much that's changing right now. It's worth mentioning that on the skill tree at this point we start taking jewel sockets, and most of these are just internal jewel sockets facing inward on the tree that we're going to use to take base jewels. Base jewels are just a good place that it doesn't need to cost much currency. It costs as much currency as you want to invest, depending on how good you want it to be, but it's a good place to shore up things like energy shield, resistances, attributes, and pardon me, I said energy shield, but before we swap over to CI, it's going to be life. But then if you can afford it, there are things like damaging ailments deal damage faster, increased fire damage, that kind of thing. They're just flexible slots to get what you need, and then if you have everything else that you need in terms of defense, you can start looking at offense too. The only special thing here to worry about is we are taking one socket on the outside of the tree where we can take cluster jewels. You could socket a regular jewel into these outside jewel sockets, but since you have to take two pathing nodes to get there, it's typically considered inefficient to use these as base jewel slots under most circumstances. You're mostly going to want to use these because you have to take that extra pathing node for cluster jewels, which are more powerful. That's why it's worth it. And the one cluster jewel we're taking so far is something, a small cluster jewel that will give us enduring composure. This is going to be how we beef up our defense by starting to include endurance charges into the build. This is how we will generate endurance charges. We're eventually going to include more of a cluster jewel setup at the end of this, but there's much more about that, of course, in the previous video. So you can refer back to that if you want to know more about the jewels and cluster jewels. I'll leave it there for now. So this might be the most important one single changeover we have in the build. A lot changes when we go from the normal mid-budget setup to spending a little bit more money to swap over to Chaos Inoculation. So it's worth taking a little time to go through this one. When we swap to Chaos Inoculation, the most important thing is that all of our gear slots need Energy Shield. Energy Shield becomes our main defensive pool, our health pool. When we do this, we no longer have life. Chaos Inoculation sets our life to 1, but it makes us immune to chaos damage. Under normal circumstances, chaos damage would bypass Energy Shield, making Energy Shield ineffective as our main health pool. Now that we've taken this node, we can use Energy Shield as the main pool. This has a lot of advantages, not the least of which is one of the 2 mandatory uniques I'm going to tell you that you have to take before you swap over to this version, and that is Aegis Aurora. If you have Energy Shield as your main health pool, this is outstanding. Recover Energy Shield equal to 2% of armor when you block. So this is a great reason to max out your block and your spell block at 75% each, so that 3/4 of the time when an enemy attempts to hit you with something, instead of taking the full amount of damage, yes, we're using glancing blows on the tree, so we do take a chunk of that damage, but we also recover a huge chunk of Energy Shield instantly. And I do mean instantly. This is not leech, this is not regen, this is not recharge. This is not something that takes place over any period of time. This says when we block, we get that Energy Shield instantly back. So this, as long as we have a sufficient amount of armor and Energy Shield to make this transition, this is a huge defensive buff. It practically makes us immortal given our other defensive layers if we're in the midst of a bunch of little hits. So Aegis Aurora is one of the things I want you to definitely have before you swap over. And the other is Incandescent Heart. So this plays so nicely with Aegis Aurora. It gives you both armor and Energy Shield. And it has another huge effect that plays nicely with Chaos Inoculation. Elemental damage from hits taken as chaos damage. Well, we are now immune to chaos damage. So 25% of elemental damage from hits is now being deleted. It is gone. It doesn't exist for us. So this is a huge defensive layer, and that's why this is one of the items that I have to insist you take before you get this before you decide to switch over to Chaos Inoculation. The other ones are your helmet, your gloves, and your boots. I'm going to want you to make sure that you have Energy Shield on all of those. I want you to make sure that you have room in your mana pool to take Discipline to get Energy Shield from there. Here's the bottom line. If you are getting less than, like, I don't know, ballpark here, less than like 32 to 3,500 Energy Shield total in Path of Building, before you swap over, don't do it. Like, if the gear you're about to add to your build results in you getting less than 32 to 3,500 Energy Shield, it's not worth it. Stick with life at that point. But if you have these 2 items, Aegis and Incandescent Heart, and the other rare items you've got have enough Energy Shield to get you over that hump, to get you to more like 4,000 Energy Shield, you're looking good defensively at that point. The other thing to note about Incandescent Heart is that in addition to its defensive benefits of giving us elemental damage taken as chaos, aka deleting it, we're also getting elemental damage as extra chaos damage. So here's an important thing to know about that. That is happening at every level of the elemental conversion. So we start with Arc dealing lightning damage. This chest armor looks at that and says, great, lightning damage. I'll take some of that and I'll deal it as extra chaos damage. Then we convert lightning damage to cold damage. This chest once again says, great, some cold damage. I'll take some of that and convert it to chaos damage. And then we convert it to fire, and it does it again. So by triple dipping in elemental conversions, we are triple dipping in our incandescent hard body armor, and that is a huge DPS boost for us. We don't want to overlook that. Now you notice I've got us backing off from Eye of Malice at this point. And this is because, listen, I'll put it this way. Hey, if you can get enough energy shield on just your gloves and boots to get yourself into that 3,500 to 4,000 energy shield range, awesome, great, no complaints. Go ahead and keep using Eye of Malice. But if you're not quite there because, hey, it's expensive to get that much energy shield on these gear slots, you can go ahead and get some more energy shield on your helmet as well. And if you do that, you're just going to want to make sure that you get some mono reservation efficiency on there as well. Now the other thing to note here is that this version does assume that you have already made that nebulous scepter switch, but you don't need to. You can still wait on that. But here's what you would need to change if you do. You would not take Melding of the Flesh, obviously. You would not take Nebulous Scepter. You would not have Purity of Ice on your gems. You just retain a normal rare scepter that had some combination of, plus skill gems, fire damage over time multiplier, damage over time multiplier, increased lightning, increased fire, avoid increased spell damage. That does nothing for you. But yeah, that's what you would hold off on. But I would say as soon as you can, start looking at getting your maximum cold resistance above 90 with a variety of means. As we talked about in the previous video, use your base jewels, use your cluster jewels, and then you can get your Melding of the Flesh. But don't get your Nebulous Scepter until you've got that max cold resist to 90, and of course the max lightning to go along with it. That's the whole point of this scepter. You just shouldn't use this unless you've got your max resistances at 90. But it is an amazing damage boost of like 500+% increased damage if you have your maximum resistances up there. So that's a no-brainer once you've got it. Just hold off until you do. And now the expensive endgame setup. There's a lot to talk about here, probably more than I can realistically do in this video, so I do apologize if I miss something, but there's so many different options that you can go with for the expensive endgame setup. I think the main thing that I want to touch on to make sure you understand is the difference between the pre and post Mage Blood versions. So I didn't establish two different loadouts for this, but there are a few things that you would do differently depending on whether you have Mage Blood or not. I definitely understand Mage Blood is a like super ultra mega end game upgrade if you're a newer player. And one of the main things that it does for us is it really helps us by allowing us to have our flasks on constantly. It allows us to use flasks with the modifiers that say increased flask effect but reduced flask duration, because we don't care about flask duration. They're on all the time. And the main thing that does for us is it makes it so easy to get maximum cold resistance from our Sapphire flask. So we have to pay much more attention to our maximum cold resist from other sources, mostly jewels, which I talked about in the previous video, but before we get Mage Blood. The other important thing though is also on this flask, chance to avoid being shocked. So I want this build to be ailment immune, and that means using Storm Shroud. Your chance to avoid being shocked applies to chance to avoid all elemental ailments. And if you've got Mage Blood, this is easy. You get 52-53+% chance to avoid being shocked as a suffix on one of your flasks, and you rely on increased flask effect to buff that up, and boom, one item, one flask gets you to 100% plus. So this flask plus Mage Blood plus Storm Shroud, you're ailment immune. Prior to that, you don't want to be relying on your flask for that, and you couldn't even use it to get to 100% anyways. You will instead rely on boots. So instead of boots that have attributes or whatever you end up needing on your boots, you will have to dedicate both an Eldritch Implicit and also a suffix which can only be applied with an essence to get your shock immunity. So you would have chance to avoid shocks with a deafening essence, and you would have chance to avoid shock as one of your Eldritch Implicits. You can get over 100% that way just with those two things on your boots. that combined with Storm Shroud is how you're going to get element immunity before you have Mage Blood. Other things related to the expensive endgame setup. So we're going to get some of our mono reservation efficiency. Rather than having a rare helmet, we can give up some defense by getting rid of a pure energy shield helmet, and we can go back to Eye of Malice, which we talked about before, and get a corruption on it that has a 90% cost and reservation multiplier. We'll just make sure that we socket our aura gems in this if we want to use this. And this is a great upgrade, but it is something that you have to weigh against the loss in energy shield that you would have to take for it. What are some other things we can do? So you can get a corruption on your Aegis Aurora shield. I went with reduced extra damage from crits. I think that's a good one. There are a lot of great corruptions you can get on the shield. Nebulous, you're going to want to go for the endgame implicit that gives you ignites, you inflict deal damage faster. Here's a thing that you might not know about this. You can use blessed orbs on a synthesized implicit like this, so it's not special. You can just use regular blessed orbs on it. So if you have like 16% deal damage faster, you can just use blessed orbs until it gets up to 20. That's easy. Let's see, Incandescent Heart. This isn't even the best in slot. I'm hesitant to even say this because it's going to make this way more expensive when I do, but in addition to just getting a corruption that gives you +2 to level of socketed duration gems, which helps us because Vol Arc is a duration gem. Regular Arc isn't, Vol Arc is. So this helps us get our main skill gem level up. But if we wanted to really go all out, we could get a double corrupted version from Alva's Temple, which is super rare to come by, that has both this corruption and the +1 to all gems corruption. That's a lot of money to spend, but it's like a super endgame option. Aureus End. This is going to depend. I have seen this flask go for as high as like 50 div and as low as like 2 div. So it's up to you, and it's up to the economy when you include this. I was able to include this super early this league. I don't know why it was so cheap this league, but I was able to include it very, very early. And I just I leave it up to whatever is going on in the economy when you are trying to follow this guide. If it's expensive, hold off on it. If it's cheap, get it early. But the explode that it adds to your build, and the fact that those explosions can in turn inflict ignites of their own, that's a beautiful thing, and it's a big DPS and clear boost for us. We don't need the main effect of +35 all elemental resistances, but also it doesn't hurt either. If we take an Eldritch Altar that lowers our resistances, this can help shore us up against that. So it's not a terrible thing either, but admittedly we do take it mostly for the explosions. Now, to be clear, for this expensive endgame section, we're looking at things that my build actually currently has equipped. These are not like aspirational, imaginary things. This is actually what my build looks like right now, but I'm going to use it as a kind of a way to show you the types of things that you can get. So like for your amulet, there's a lot of things you can do with your amulet. This was something that I got early on at kind of a steal of a price and just never upgraded from. I'm sure that you could get an upgrade like a simplex amulet that's got some crazy +4 to all skill gems, costs 1 million divines kind of a thing. This was just so good at such a low price that I've ended up keeping it forever because I just kept finding other things that I wanted to spend divine orbs on, and the options for upgrading amulet were either not as good or cost hundreds of divines. So the things that I got here were lightning skill gems, damage over time multiplier, energy shield, a big chunk of resistance, increased armor, and then dexterity. You could also get strength on an amulet if you're hard up for strength, but you're more likely to be hard up for dexterity. And then I did allocate Whispers of Doom. At this point, I take those skill points away from pathing up to Whispers of Doom on the tree. I anoint it, and I use those points for other things. The gloves and the boots, like I said, the boots, it's going to depend on whether you are pre or post Mage Blood. Pre Mage Blood, you're going to need to have that shock immunity. Post Mage Blood, just get your attributes, get your resistances. It's much easier this way. And then once you don't have to get shock immunity in your implicits as well, you can get just pure damage implicits, which is what I've got there. For my gloves, the implicits on the gloves are not going to change except in one circumstance. You're always going to want fire exposure on hit, and ideally as high of a roll as possible. I'm lazy. I have not rolled, from 11. You can roll higher. But the ignites you inflict spread. This one you can technically change out if on your Megalomaniac, if you get Fan the Flames on a Megalomaniac or on some other cluster jewel. If you get Fan the Flames, which has this effect of spreading ignites, you can instead roll that implicit to be fire damage over time multiplier. So that's just one way in which your Megalomaniac has more DPS options. You can get the ignites spreading modifier there, but it's kind of the equivalent of getting damage over time multiplier on the Megalomaniac instead, because you can just swap out the modifier on the gloves. And I think the only other thing to cover really is going to be the corruptions on Call of the Brotherhood. So typically, Call of the Brotherhood as a 2-stone ring would come with implicits of just elemental resistances. So it's not going to be easy to swap away from that before you have Mage Blood. It's possible, depending on what else you do with your jewels and your tree and your gear, but it's going to be easier after you get Mage Blood to swap over to implicits that don't give you resistances. But bleeding immunity is so good. Like, when you already have corrupted blood immunity, a bunch of armor, a bunch of, elemental resistances, suddenly bleeds coming out of nowhere and spiking your health down feels jarring. It comes out of nowhere. It's one of the few things left that can suddenly kill you. And so getting immunity to bleed was such a relief on this one. On the other ring, you can get Determination effect, you can get Malevolence effect. There's actually a lot of things you can get as corruptions on rings. I've even seen some people do Malevolence increased aura effect, and then getting a Calandra's Touch to mirror that ring. And Calandra's Touch, that's just going to be one of those things that it comes down to the price. If you can get a second ring that does exactly what you want it to for less than the price of a Calandra's Touch, then just do that instead. It's just a cost-saving measure. And I think that might be it. Again, I do apologize if I have missed anything. There's a lot going on here, but I think I've covered as much as I can for the moment. So that brings us to the end of the main path. Again, there is a novice path that will walk you through the campaign if you want to see that, but this does bring us to the end of the main guide. If you've stuck with me for this long, thank you so much. Put any questions, comments. If you've attempted the build, if you want me to check your path of building file, definitely feel free to put that down in the comments. I'm more than happy to take a look with you. And in the meantime, thank you for tuning in, and take it easy.